I want to tell you about my first marriage. My first marriage was a mistake. Donna's a shrink. She's very interested in this. What?
Is this fiction or real?
This is real.
Okay.
But that's part of the talk, right?
Okay.
What's real, what's not, right? Okay. My first marriage was a mistake. Now, from the outside, it looked pretty successful. We were both successful writers. We were Glamour magazine's answer couple. We would answer the questions every month. We were on NBC as the answer couple. And people thought we were this pretty great couple. Problem was, we started as friends. We should have stayed friends. And it was a marriage that didn't have chemistry, which I don't know about you, but you have to have it. So it was, in a way, living a lie. We decided to get divorced. This will relate to fiction, okay? We decided to get divorced, and if you've ever been divorced or in any kind of relationship that's broken up, whether or not it was a good one or a bad one, it's pretty lonely when the relationship breaks up. And certainly that was a lonely time. And what we decided to do was not tell anyone that we were getting divorced. So we continued to live in the apartment, and for 3 months. And at the end of the 3 months, we split up. Well, it was lonely, it was depressing, and I started a book. I had an idea right outside this library just before I started that book. And the idea had stayed in my mind for about 8 years, and now is a perfect time to start the book, even though it started in Lee. I sat down, and every day my troubles went away, and I immersed myself in that idea, and I finished the book 4 months later. Now, previous to that, books had taken 3 years, 2 years, a year, never 4 months. And I don't want to tell you that everything I write works, because certainly many things don't work. One time, the New York Times said about one of my books, trash, throw it across the room. Well, the Washington Post liked it, but the Times hated it. That's a whole nother speech about critics. But this book really succeeded. I mean, it really succeeded. It was a Washington Post bestseller. It was a book club selection. It was bought by numerous countries overseas. Jodie Foster read it and wanted to star in it, and Paramount bought it. They didn't option it, they bought it. And I was in airports. I was number 6 in airports. The thing I could never figure out about the book was, why 4 months, right? We're talking about creativity and where it came from. So why would with all these books that took 3 years, 2 years, why 4 months? And I never figured it out for about 5 years. When I was going through an old album of reviews, I keep the bad ones and the good ones, and I got to a New York Times review. The New York Times said, because it was about espionage on the surface, not just a great book about espionage, but a terrific book about the loneliness of living a secret life. But where did that book come from, right? A guy getting divorced in a room who feels bad, who's in a marriage that everybody thinks is successful. And he sits down and he pours himself into what on the surface looks like a spy story, but underneath it's a story about the loneliness of living a lie. People ask me questions oftentimes, where do you get your ideas? What's your schedule? How do you deal with publishers? How do you do research? But you see, all these questions boil down to one question, and for our 2 guys writers in the audience, how do you get in that zone, right? How do you get in the zone where everything bursts out and creativity takes over, and 7 hours later you realize 7 hours passed, and what you've produced is great, and not something that you think is great, but it's not? How do you get into that zone? I'm a commercial writer. Have you guys heard of Tim O'Brien? Tim O'Brien, he wrote Going After Casiano, won the National Book Award. Great Vietnam writer. I called him up one time and he said, I've been in the cave, so I couldn't answer the question. I couldn't answer the phone. And Kim Adonisio is a terrific poet. You know her stuff, great. Terrific poet, wild, great person. Talked to her once on the phone. She said, I've been in the aquifer, she said. Jim Grady wrote The 6 Days of the Condor, Anyone ever see that movie with Robert Redford? Global bestseller, started the "We don't trust the CIA" period in fiction. Whenever I call up Grady, if he answers, he goes, "I'm coming out of the submarine." And Neil Baldwin, who's a nonfiction writer, you do both, a nonfiction writer, wrote a great book about Martha Graham, came out this past year, and spoke at Jacob's Pillow. When people ask him about writing, he says, well, there's the writing and the real writing. And for me, I say, I'm in the hole. So how come all these people, literary person, poet, nonfiction writer, fiction writer, commercial writer, what are we all doing in this same place when we talk about where fiction comes from? Why do we all use the same metaphor in a way to describe what happens in our heads? And how, if you're a writer, can you get to that place in your head and create the best things that you are capable of producing? It all gets distilled down to one word. Sometimes if I'm teaching at a college, students will come to me and I'll say, what's your book about? And they'll say, and if they say, well, it's about this, if they use the word and, they don't know. As soon as they say two things, they've made a mistake. They think if it's about two things, three things, five things, then it's got more. No, then it's been distilled and it's been diffused and it has less. It's about grief. It's about rage. It's about loneliness. It's about wanting love. If you can get your idea down to that launch point, that one-word launch point, one concept launch point, some writers have to think about it. I do. Some writers, it happens naturally. They don't have to think about it. But everybody has to get there. And if you can get down to that place, that one place, whatever it is, everything then erupts out of it. So let's look at this room. It's just a room in a library in Lee, Massachusetts. I'm giving a talk, and millions of people around the world are watching this on cable television, right? And 5, 6 people here, yay, are in the room. But let's imagine this room if we're writing a book about loneliness, okay? Look at all these empty chairs, right? Well, here's this guy, he's an author, and he's hoping for like 50 people, 100 people. What does he have, like 5 people? Oh, a terrible thing. No, it's not a book about loneliness. It's a book about joy. Wow, here's this writer who's finished the book. He's so happy. He gets to share the ideas, stand in front of people. There's happy paintings on the wall. It's a really clean room. It's great. Nope, let's change it again. Donald Trump's limousine broke down on Main Street, and he wandered in here. And Donald Trump is looking around. It's dirty. There could be germs. There's only 5 people. It's a tiny crowd. I hate it. I want a big crowd. Everything comes from that one word. And so you might have a plot. You might have a story. You might have a character. But you need to know where it's coming from in you. And that's where books come from. Now me, when I was a kid, I wanted, and I thought, what do you want when you grow up? There were 2 things that I wanted. I loved Life magazine. I wanted to be the guy that Life magazine sent all around the world, trouble spots, great spots, Amazon, rainforests. But I also loved thriller novels. I like novels that dealt with realities in the world and what could happen in the world. Novel like Failsafe with nuclear war. Novel like On the Beach, what could happen if there's nuclear war. These would be authors who would synthesize things going on in the world and produce what could happen in a way that millions of people would listen to and read, and they would suddenly see a possibility on Earth that they never saw before. And I wanted to be that guy too. I lucked out. I got to do both. I became a journalist, and as a journalist, I got to go to those places. In the Amazon, research bases in Antarctica, trouble spots in South Africa, hanging out with a warlord in Mogadishu. And for years, I wrote journalism. And then because of that, I was able to take the stuff that I learned. I mean, look, the books on these tables, there's not a single book there that doesn't come from something I learned when I was a journalist. And you don't know when you're learning it that it's the thing that will someday be in a novel. It's something you don't think about that day. And then 8 years later, it bursts out, and it's a novel. Some people call this commercial fiction. So if you go into Barnes & Noble, in like the commercial fiction category, there's a literary fiction category. I call this effective fiction. Effective because you can, and it's not taught in colleges, and I wish it was. I've never understood why colleges will teach public relations as a way of swaying the public, marketing as a way of swaying the public, commercials as a way of swaying the public. But you hold up a thriller novel, they'll go, that's a thriller. It's a thriller, it's stupid. Let's talk about thrillers. You know my favorite thriller, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Well, you want to talk about a book that affected people? And it wasn't a literary book. On the Beach, Failsafe, you were nodding before when we talked about that. Failsafe. Those books moved hundreds of millions of people around the world to action, political action. It affected the way they voted. It affected the conversations around tables. It affected things more than flowcharts and reports and academic studies. In 1988, as a perfect example of this, amazing thing happened in Washington, D.C. Premier Gorbachev of the Soviet Union, I'm dating myself, came to Washington, signed a nuclear test ban treaty with Ronald Reagan. Anybody here remember that, or only me? Thank you. All right, we're all dated. Great. Yeah, okay. Well, that's a pretty amazing thing, right? Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire, and the Republicans didn't want him to sign that treaty. And yet he signed a treaty that no one thought he ever would sign, and limited the nuclear arsenal of the two biggest superpowers on Earth. After he signed that treaty, he sent a note to someone, sent a little note to a guy named Nicholas Meyer. And the note said, don't think you had nothing to do with this, because you'd be wrong. Anybody know who Nicholas Meyer was?
A writer.
He was a writer, that's right. His first book was called The 7% Solution, about Sherlock Holmes. So probably that wasn't the reason Reagan was thanking him, right? And then he wrote a book called The Great Train Robbery, about some train robbery in Europe. Well, that's not it. But then ABC came to him and they said, will you make a movie for us called The Day After Tomorrow? Now, you may remember that movie because it's about what happens if there was a nuclear exchange in the town of Lawrence, Kansas. Well, Reagan watched that, and Reagan sent a note to Nicholas Meyer. He didn't send a note to a Harvard. He didn't send a note to a general. He didn't send a note to the Secretary of State. He sent a note to Nicholas Meyer, a guy who filmed a thriller. So I wanted to write that kind of book. And I got to travel the world, meet politicians, presidents, gang members, all kinds of people. And I was always learning. And what I learned informed my fiction. So you might ask yourself, well, how effective is it? Okay, I'm not Nicholas Meyer. I didn't do the ABC movie. I'm not Harriet Beecher Stowe. I didn't write Uncle Tom's Cabin. You're a guy in a room. You could die there and no one would know. You're there for months and months writing your fiction. Who's to say that you really could realize this dream of writing something that actually has an effect? So let me tell you a story. Unfortunately, I have two friends who've been bombed by terrorists. The guy Kenny Gorzinski, in my Saturday morning basketball team when I was in high school, was on the Lockerbie flight that got blown up by the Libyans. And Mike Moffett, who was the second baseman in my softball team in Washington, got in a borrowed car one day with his wife and was driving to work, and the Chilean secret police blew him up. They killed his wife. They cut the driver in half. Michael was the only survivor, and later said he was sitting in the car. He heard a sound like water dripping on a hot wire. Then there was a flash of light, and then he was sitting on the curb, and his wife was next to him. She was hyperventilating. He thought she was having trouble, just nervous. She was drowning because she'd been cut by glass from the explosion. So I knew two people. I knew two people who'd been in bombings, right? I knew them. And I was in the courtroom when the perpetrator of that bombing was sentenced. And I watched the prosecutors argue for leniency, and it was awful. So the guy in the room decided to tackle this issue, and I wrote a book called Divine Assassin. I thought, why doesn't someone kill Gaddafi? You know, why doesn't someone kill the leader of the country that perpetrates these horrible acts? And so I decided to write a book about just some average guy who knows, you know, who's a friend, his lover is killed by terrorists, and decides to kill Gaddafi. Now again, this is just a guy, me, just a writer in a room, no connections. Because I'd been a journalist, I knew a mercenary, and because I lived in Washington, I knew a mercenary, and he had been telling me things for years, which were great things. I never knew if they were true or not, but they always seemed to bear out. One time I visited him in Italy, and he said, well, you have to leave during the day for the next couple of days because I'm interviewing people for a coup. Like you interview people to work at the Dunkin' Donuts, you interview people who work at a law firm, you interview people to carry out a coup. So I'd leave the apartment, I'd come back, there wasn't anybody there. I never saw if anybody was there being interviewed for a coup. But then 3 months later, everything he told me was in the paper. A coup had been stopped in the Seychelles Islands. He was named. So that one was true. Another time, after the Falklands War, you remember that? The British are heading toward Argentina. And he told me that he had a medal, that the British had given him a medal, and the medal was in a safe. Couldn't see the medal. Okay. And why did he get the medal? Because as the British fleet was crossing the Atlantic and heading for the Falkland Islands, the British were nervous that the Argentinians would have a missile called the Exocet missile, which could fly low and blow up ships. And there were Exocets for sale on the black market, and they needed to get the Exocets off the black market so the Argentinians wouldn't get hold of them. And John, my friend the mercenary, said, well, I cornered the black market Exocets. Was it true? Was it not true? Did he have a medal that was in a safe? Well, 4 days later, the London Times comes out with some big expose about what happened in the Falklands, and a mystery man who, working for the British, apparently bought up all the Exocets. So once again, I guess he was telling the truth. So now let's get to Gaddafi. I used to work for Gaddafi, he told me, because Gaddafi at one time was regarded as anti-communist, helping the United States. And so John told me things about Gaddafi. Told me that Gaddafi always had a submarine off Benghazi in case there was a coup. He described what Gaddafi's inner office looked like. It wasn't necessary to verify this stuff because it was a fictional novel, so I put it in, right? Now let's get to the question of, can any of this stuff be effective? The novel comes out, did okay, and I'm at home one day, and I get a phone call from a friend of mine who was Charlie Rose, Charlie Rose's producer. And his name was Jack. And Jack tells me that the Libyans had been courting him as a possible friendly journalist. Jack had been asked to come to Manhattan and meet with the Libyan foreign minister, the Libyan UN ambassador, the top 5 Libyans in the United States, for a dinner in a tent at the top of a 27-story building that the Libyans owned. And during the dinner, Jack said, the Libyans started complaining that they got bad press coverage in the United States. And Jack said, well, I have a friend who wrote a book about Gaddafi. Thank you, Jack. I said, and the UN ambassador says, well, what's your friend's name? And as soon as Jack said, when I said your name, everyone went crazy in that tent. They said, like, where'd that guy get that information? Who is that guy? How did that guy find that stuff out? So, who would have guessed that the work that was produced in my bedroom, you know, this is where I wrote those days, would reach those guys? And then, a week later, there's a knock at my door. I open the door, and there's a guy standing there who says, "I'm your new neighbor." He's moved in across the hall, right across the hall. He says, "I'm Egyptian," he says, and I'm trying to get a job as a translator from Arabic to English, and can you look at a sample of my work and tell me whether this is really good English? I invited him in, and we talked about Gaddafi book, because the Egyptians and the Libyans don't get along. And I helped him out on how to make his proposal better. A couple days later, knock, knock, knock. He shows me something else for another job interview. 3 days go by, he calls me up one day. He says, "Wow, something great happened. I just got a job at the Libyan embassy," he says. "I know, why don't you come for lunch at the embassy? And we'll go in the embassy and we'll have lunch." I said, "Are you out of your," I won't say this on internationally broadcast television, I won't say exactly what I said, but I said, "No, I'm not stepping into that embassy." 3 days later, he moved out. I never saw him again. He didn't say, "Well, let's have lunch in a restaurant if you can't come to the embassy," right? He didn't say, "Let's get together after work." No, come to the embassy, he moves out. Who was that guy? Did the Libyans actually send that guy? I'll never know. But here's the thing. You do your best, right? If you want to have an effect. So, you always try. Tips, right? Let's get to the tips part. Tips for those people who want to write. Know the idea. I mean, really know the idea. Be able to articulate the idea to yourself without the word "and" in it. I want to write about this, not this and. Don't put "and." As soon as you put "and" in, the two things will start fighting. Every time you get to your desk and your computer and you start to write, one of the things will want to be paramount, the other thing will want to be paramount. You'll think you're adding extra depth. You won't. You'll be pulling depth away from one of the things. Start with a hook. You guys probably know that, who are already writers, but editors will read half a page and turn your book down. An editor at a New York house comes home every night with a stack of manuscripts that's this high. They get on the train. They know that 99 out of 100 manuscripts at best are rejections, and they're looking for any reason to reject your manuscript. They're dying to find something that they like, but they have to slog through 99 things. If you're thinking, wait till he gets to chapter 2, you're dead. He won't get to chapter 2. In every book, there are things you really care about and things you don't care about as much. Problem is, they have to be the same quality in the book. You have to force yourself to work as harder on the aspects of a book that you're not interested in, because you're not interested in them, so that when a reader who's not you reads the book, everything looks even. So, and one of the problems is when you're writing a book and you're starting out, you always have a little guy on your shoulder, a little woman, saying when something's wrong. I do. Sometimes the little guy, it's guy for me, he'll say something's wrong. I'll say, what is it? The little guy will say, you figure it out. It's not my problem. I said, well, give me a hint. Doesn't say anything. Little hint. Doesn't say anything. I'm just going to tell you something's wrong. So, always listen to that guy. Always listen to that guy. And another tip is when you're writing, whether it's a literary book or a journey or a commercial book, you know the term surface friction? Surface friction. Surface friction is a sense of friction that a reader has every sentence. You can't have 6 pages that are flat, even if the stuff after it is good. That friction has to be in every sentence. You have to figure out a way. Choice. This is the biggest thing about novels. One of the most important things in novels are the choices that your character makes. And let's go back to Tim O'Brien for a minute, the National Book Award winner, and a terrific teacher who I saw at Bread Loaf Writers Conference once in Vermont, and he gave his class this problem. He said to the class, who here has a real story that they want to fictionalize, okay, like what you want to do? Who has a real story that they'd like to fictionalize? And there was a guy from Montana named Les, a Vietnam veteran. He said, I do, and this is what he told the class. He said, before I went to Vietnam, with my best buddy, we made a pact. And the pact was, if one of us got injured, really badly injured, like horribly injured but still alive, then the other person had to pull the plug on him, because neither of them wanted to live incapacitated. And they went to Vietnam. This class took place 15 years after Vietnam, but Les was telling the story. They went to Vietnam, they both got injured, the buddy got blown up, and just before coming to the writers' conference, Les had gone to visit his buddy where he was still in the hospital after 15 years, and Les walked into the room, and his buddy said, do it. He said, do it. He said, you promised, and you have to do it. And was ripping Les up, because he didn't do it. So Tim turned to the class, and he said, okay, if this was a novel, I mean, this is a painful human experience that really happened, but if it was a novel, how would we do it? How would we deal with it? See, let's get the choice. And people would say, well, I'll show them when they were kids, and then I'd show them when they went to Vietnam, and I'll show them when they got... After a while, Tim said, no, you start with the choice. You start with Les walking into that room and the guy saying, do it. Choice is the most important thing that in a novel. If there's no choice, if things are happening without choice, if things are happening because you want them to and they wouldn't happen like that, if things are happening too easily, if you have a character who is too passive and things just happen to him or her and there's no choice, the book will fail. So that's choice. Let's talk about research for a second. Well, let me ask you a question, because we've been here, you know, we have an hour, and then after the hour, the TV guys shoot me, and we have to leave. So I know you're going to have questions, and I was going to read. Here's my question: would you like me to read something, or would you want to go right to the questions? It's about a 15-minute read. There's only 5, so anybody care?
I'd enjoy hearing some of your work.
You want to?
Yeah,
Okay.
read by you.
Okay. Then that's what we'll do. So let's talk about research just for a minute, and then I'll read, and then we'll have, I hope, a lot of questions, especially from you, the vicious question-answer asker of Massachusetts. So research, extra interesting for you because you want to fictionalize stuff. Research is very different for fiction and for nonfiction. Nonfiction, you're researching what happened. You cannot get away from it. You don't play with it. Fiction, you have to make sure who is in control of the research. Are you in control, or is the research in control? Now, if you're writing a historical novel, then you're pretty much sticking with the research and filling in the blanks. But if you're writing a what-if novel, see, my novels are about what if. What if oil stopped tomorrow? What if oil stopped tomorrow is Black Monday? What if the 1918 flu got out again? That's white plague. What if? That's what I write. So how do you research something that didn't happen yet, right? How do you do that? You have to be in control of the facts. You can't change them, but you can modify them. So I'll give you an example, and then I'll read. Black Monday, was a book about a genetically engineered organism gets into the world's oil supply, it stops it dead. Suddenly, lawnmowers stop running, cars stop running. It's a microorganism. No one knows where it came from. It clings to metal. So once it's in a tank, you can't use it again. Airplanes fall from the sky, then you can't fly, then you can't drive. There's a 30-day countdown. pretty much to the end of civilization, I wanted to write about what if oil stopped, because I was following the fights about you can't have any oil. We have to go cold turkey from oil. What if? Well, in order to invent this microorganism, I had to invent a microorganism that could move through oil fields, simultaneously appear in oil fields around the world that are not connected, and survive refining, which is 800 degrees, which nothing can survive, allegedly. And so first I contact, and what you can do if you're a novelist is you seek out the experts. If you're writing a what-if book, and you introduce yourself, I'm a novelist. I know some experts like to play with their area of expertise. Some areas don't. I hope you like to play. So first I found the professor at the University of Texas, the heat-resistant bacteria expert. He got it up to 250, 300 degrees, hot vents under the ocean. I want you to believe 800 degrees. 250 is not enough. Okay, so that's not going to work. So then I tried to research the way that bacteria protect themselves. They form spores. Anthrax forms spores. Tuberculosis forms spores. So if you form a spore, maybe I could get it up to 300, 350, something like that. Then I went to see the professor at the University of Maryland who the federal government brought in when anthrax was mailed to Congress. Remember that? And I said, well, this is what I'm trying to do. Is it possible that I could come up with a bacteria that survives, even a genetically engineered one, survives 800 degrees? No. This is what always happens at first. No, it's impossible. Well, what if I do this? Nope. Well, how about if I do that? Nope. Well, what about these things? No, it's impossible. Don't do it. You should write another book and throw this book away, the guy said. And I get up, and by now the book's under contract, so I have to produce this book. And just when I'm reaching for the knob, I hear him say, well, and I turn around, and believe me, Alan Dershowitz said well once, and Sam Dash, the Watergate prosecutor, said well once to me, and now this guy said well. And well, he goes, I don't know about what you're asking, he says, but I do have a file in my desk of bacteria that were considered impossible 5 years ago, but it turned out that they exist. Would you like to see that file? Yes, I want to see the file. So he gives me the file. Now we give the reader that information. We got 250. We got it up to 400. We have a file of real bacteria that were considered impossible. The last piece, have you ever heard of mad cow disease? Mad cow disease caused by something called prions, not bacteria, not virus. No one knows what it is, really. They took a sheep that had mad cow disease. They cooked the brains to 600, 650 degrees. They gave it to another sheep. Sheep got mad cow disease. Once I give the reader all of those facts, the reader is willing to give me 100 extra degrees. And when that book came out, I got contacted by a book club in Alaska, and they called up. They said, we heard about this Black Monday, and we're a new book club, and you are the very first book that we are going to read. And I was like, that's great. And they went, yeah, but before you say it's great, we should tell you that the purpose of our book club is to find mistakes. Because we all work in the oil industry, and we're sick of the way that the oil industry is shown in novels. And so everyone in our book club is reading your book to find mistakes. And a month went by, and 6 weeks went by. And finally, I didn't hear from them. I had to know. I called up, and I get this depressed-sounding woman on the other end. And she goes, we didn't find any mistakes. So that's the purpose of research in a fiction book. Let me read a little bit from The Last Spy. This is a novel that I told you about, where I got the idea in Lee, outside this library. And it starts in 1967. And I'm going to read you that part, and then after this it will move to 1991. So, here we go. They were laughing at him again. The whole class, howling. It made his face burn, his ears pound. He wanted to crawl into a closet and lock the door. He wanted to be invisible. He dug his fingernails into his palms under his desk, where the other kids couldn't see, and in his head the boy repeated, "I won't cry." "A camera," giggled the fat girl, Glory Haynes, in the first row, sending the class into paroxysms of laughter. "He thinks you can put a camera in a bomb." It wasn't a stupid question, the boy cried from his seat in back, but it was no use. Even his teacher joined in. "That's quite a notion, James," she chuckled, half covering her smile with her fingers, concealing nothing. "Your head is on the moon," someone shouted. "Moon boy, moon boy." The chant grew louder. "Moon." The boy tried again. "Why can't you put a camera in a bomb? Then you could make it go where you want, like a model plane." To his right, one of the McNeil boys curled in the aisle, holding his stomach, gasping for breath, he was laughing so hard. A spitball flew by the boy's head and struck the bulletin board and the Our Town, Smith Falls, Massachusetts sign. Laughter seemed to draw the walls in, to suck away air. Everything was whirling. The American flag by the row of windows, the traffic safety and fifth grade bulletin board, the Berkshire Eagle, photo of President Johnson and Premier Brezhnev at a conference, the Russian pounding his fist on a table, the science corner filled with dioramas of local black bears and deer, like a model plane. Ha ha ha! Miss Dietz leaned back against the board to maintain composure. She smudged the "Where is Vietnam?" she had chalked beside the unrolled map of Red China. It was current events hour. They had talked about communist gains, like guerrillas in Peru, and how communist guerrillas in Southeast Asia were beating Americans, and South Vietnamese troops, how they attacked and retreated into the jungle where the Americans could not find them, could not fight them with bombs. So the boy had asked, so why not put cameras in the bombs so when they drop, you can see where they're going and you can guide them to the target? He wanted to close his eyes, wanted to leave this place. The worst part was, she was laughing. He knew if he looked at her, he would feel worse, but he couldn't help it. He turned and she was right behind him, 1 seat away. Karina, he thought, her face so beautiful it made his knees weak. Now it was twisted, mouth contorted into a hole, skin blotchy with laughter, long blonde hair bouncing as she shook. Her voice usually made him feel like someone was caressing his neck. Now an animal squeal came from her, as if she had someone else's voice, someone crueler who could not possibly be her. Her lips pulled back, showing little white teeth. Her blue eyes had a glazed, shiny excitement, turned toward the boy beside her, toward Cabot, the tall, dark-haired boy named Cabot, the boy everyone looked up to, even Miss Dietz, the boy who earned straight A's, who captained the softball team, who seemed older than 10 already, whom everyone admired, everyone loved, nobody questioned, nobody called Moon Boy. Cabot could have stopped the laughing. All he had to do was look at them quietly, and they would stop, but Cabot had started it. Doesn't he ever make mistakes, the boy thought? Doesn't he ever do anything wrong? Even now, Cabot stared back, braying, but something besides humor was in his black eyes, something hard and appraising behind the laughter, something malevolent. "Dumbest question I ever heard," Cabot said softly, just for the boy, but that was when the boy spotted it, the slightest tapping at the end of Cabot's index finger. Not a movement really, or even a motion, more like a whisper of activity in the air, a feint, a twitch, almost not there. It was the kind of thing the boy was good at detecting, the little giveaway. He's lying, thought the boy. He liked my question. Well, then why is he making them laugh? For the boy, the world reduced itself to the triangle of faces. The lovely blonde girl in the yellow sundress, the tall, slender, dark-haired boy with the button on his pressed paisley shirt that said McCarthy, and himself, the freckled-faced target in the white polo shirt, crew cut, and rolled-up baggy jeans, looking at others who would not let him in. "Why don't you get blown up by a bomb?" someone growled. It was Danny Minsky, the short, angry kid who followed Cabot everywhere. "No, don't leave us, Jimmy. Who would ask the stupid questions then?" Ira Stowe cried. "Calm down, class," said Miss Dietz. The boys stood. Miss Dietz said sharper, "James." The boy walked toward the door. "James, sit down," the teacher commanded. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing him run. He moved calmly. Miss Dietz cried, "You need a permission slip to leave the room." The boy turned left into the wide, empty corridor and shoved his hands in his pockets to break his speed. He heard laughter welling after him. "Now what's he doing?" Cabot's voice shouted. He walked past rows of lockers, one with Joe Namath throwing a football pasted on front, out the double elementary school doors, and under the Thanksgiving 1967 sign, with its pilgrim and strutting turkey cutouts. He was alone in the school parking lot. Pumpkin and apple-colored leaves blew against the white walls of the Fords and Chevys. A cold wind blew from the west. When he looked up, laughter echoed down from the second-story windows, lined with heads. "James, come back. Why can't you be like Cabot?" But then they were gone, and he was running down the long driveway to Main Street, past a windbreak of evergreens obscuring the school, a small boy running through Smith Falls, past Hanson's Five and Dime and the white colonial facade of Lester House, where tourist skiers ate steaks on December nights, past the tattered signs on the community bulletin board from last summer's theater festival, and past the Price Chopper, where housewives peered out at him as they shoved shopping bags into station wagons. "Jimmy, school out early? Out for the track team, pal?" He almost ran into Sergeant Curtis as the policeman left Moe's clip and shave, fresh from his 2 o'clock, smelling hair lotion on his hands. The sergeant called out, "You!" But he didn't stop. He breathed harder, gasping. After the firehouse, he stumbled into a field, crisp dead leaves trapped in weedy grass, and the oaky smell of woods came to him. It was hard to see now from tears. He nearly ran into the barbed wire fence. The boy stood, gasping, nose an inch from the cold, rusty wire. The strands were so high that they seemed to cordon off the sky when he looked up. 10 feet away, on the other side of the barrier, a soldier lumbered toward him with an old World War II Thompson slung over his half-buttoned tunic. Troops in this part of Siberia always got new issue weapons last. The soldier looked down at the boy, dwarfing him. He took off his cotton cap with the red star on it and wiped his hands over thinning, straw-colored hair. "Now you've done it," he said gently. The tone released the boy's anguish. Weeping, he cried, "I want to go home." The corporal pulled a shiny apple from his pocket and offered it through the wire, but the boy shook his head. "I don't care if I cut myself going over. Just tell me which way to go," he begged. "Walk away and I'll climb over. I'll never tell anyone you helped." "You're going to get me in trouble," the soldier sighed, "coming here all the time. They'll transfer me, and then who will I have to talk to on Sundays?" They sat cross-legged on the grass, barbed wire between them. Behind the soldier, the boy could see a flat vista of knee-high grass, waving slightly, severed by a single dirt track rutted by carts. It led toward the empty horizon, which rose rather than fell, implying vastness, giving the feeling of being lost in an immense shallow bowl. The trees out there were different from the ones in town, shorter white Russian alders instead of American maples, already dying in this climate. The soldier spread a crumpled handkerchief on the grass. Yellow cheese on red cotton, he sliced the cheese in thin strips with his bayonet knife. He handed a slice through the fence. He smiled when the boy chewed it. How proud your parents are of you, he said. I don't remember them. Why'd they send me away? They're important or you wouldn't be here. The soldier's voice grew hearty, but it was clear he felt sorry for the boy. Cheer up. You get meat every day. You get milk. You have other children to play with. It's not so bad. The boy said, if there's a road, there's people. I'll get away and never tell anyone you did it. The soldier laughed at that, but frowned at the growl of the inevitable search car. A cloud of advancing dust marked its approach. Sure, they'll never guess, he said, slicing cheese. My mother sent this from the Ukraine. It wasn't a stupid question, the boy blurted. It wasn't. The soldier nodded thoughtfully as the town police car came into view. Sergeant Curtis at the wheel, the principal and Miss Dietz in back. If you asked the question, it couldn't have been stupid, the soldier said. The soldier dusted himself off and groaned as he rose, standing to attention. He stayed near the boy until the principal and Miss Dietz got close. The principal, Mr. Duchamp, was a wiry, nervous KGB major in a gray suit. He hated pretending he was American all day. He thought the whole facsimile town was an idea doomed to fail. He turned his wrath on the trooper first. I've warned you not to encourage him. I'm going to get you transferred. He turned on the boy. Into the car, now. None of them spoke on the ride back. The technique was supposed to intimidate him, but he liked the air on his face through the open window. He liked the idea of being free. The illusion ended when they pulled up to school, and then he was in the principal's office on the leather couch, listening to Duchamp and Dietz in the office on the other side of the cinder block wall with its color photo of dead President Kennedy on it. They thought he couldn't hear them. He doesn't fit in here, the principal said. He asks questions he shouldn't. He disrupts the class, Miss Dietz said. It was a mistake to bring him here, I'll say. He should go back, Duchamp said. The boy leaned forward, scarcely breathing. Please, 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 he thought. Absolutely, Miss Dietz said. Then we're agreed. Write up the report, and in a few weeks he'll be gone, and we can concentrate on the others. In the pause that followed, the boy's heart began to sink. Then Miss Dietz said with a low, crafty tone, I think it would be better if you wrote the report, Comrade Principal. After all, you are in charge of the school. You carry more weight. But you're his teacher. You know him more intimately, coaxed the principal. You can describe his problems in the strongest possible terms. The boy imagined the two adults looking at each other. Miss Dietz said, you know who his parents are? It's really your job. A few moments later, they returned to the office. Duchamp beamed. We've decided to give you another chance, James. We know how important it is for you to be here, and I know how hard you'll work to fit in, to make your parents happy. And Uncle Yuri, you don't want to disappoint him, do you? That's not asking much, is it? Broad grin. The principal wagged a finger at the boy. He sat down at his desk, as if he had important work to do, as if this matter had distracted him for as much time as he could spare. He was thinking that he wished he were back in Moscow, that the kids in his charge had a horrible fate in store for them, that even Hitler, whom he had fought against 23 years before, wouldn't have done this to kids. I know you'll behave from now on, the principal said. Thank you. So I hope we have some questions about anything, really. Writing.
Okay, I got something.
You.
You know, you caught me in that opening, in that, you know, I could picture myself as that kid. You know, first of all, you don't realize until later on that it's not the true story of an American kid in school, but he's a Russian youth being trained to become a spy later on, or implanted in America. And I was thinking about how tend to buy books or read stories that I can identify with as a character. You know, whether it's Joe Nesbo's, detective, alcoholic cop, or I'm reading this book, James Lee Burke, about New Orleans and the southern Cajun people.
Right.
And I can identify with the characters, and if you don't have that identification, do you still get the hook that you try to create, or those books, will I put them aside and stop reading them halfway through because they're too alien?
I think, yes, I think you always have the identification. I mean, we all read books where we identify with the characters. Someone else doesn't identify with those characters, they read those books. Those books that you identify with those characters. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's Shakespeare or Madame Bovary or James Lee Burke and Dave Robichaux, who's a great cop. Yes, I mean, and the reason that and this goes back to how we started, right? Grief. Have we experienced grief? Everybody has. Passion, vengeance, name something. The thing that good novelists do is that they synthesize human emotions, and they synthesize general human emotions and situations, and they can recreate them. When you are writing a novel, you're synthesizing patterns of behavior that people are familiar with. Otherwise, we still wouldn't be reading stuff from ancient Greece. Other hand, Donna, your hand was up.
My hand was up because I was struck by something you said in the beginning about wanting to make an impact, wanting to write something that made a difference or was affected people. And I wondered when you said that, well, what about that first book that sold so many copies and was, became internationally distributed? Doesn't that kind of book satisfy as affecting people and maybe the world? Because if people are reading books like that loneliness book, it changes them, and as people change, the world evolves a little bit.
So are you asking about the book I just read from?
No, in the beginning.
You said that first book. What first book?
When you were talking about the book that you wrote about loneliness after your divorce.
That is the book I read.
That's the book?
Yes. That's a lonely boy.
He is a lonely boy. Yeah.
That's a lonely kid. And when we pick him up 20 years later, he's...
Copies.
What?
It sold a lot of copies.
Yes.
A lot of people read it.
Yes.
Okay.
So,
the question is it enough to write a book that many people read, identify with, and it changes them?
Is it... Are you asking, is it enough, or does it change them?
No. And in changing people, it changes the world. There's an evolutionary process that sets up, gets in place when people are reading and evolving through the reading of the identifications with the characters.
Donna's a shrink, so you're asking a shrink question.
Okay. So.
Wait, hold it.
Okay, so maybe it's not political. Maybe.
I understand the question.
Okay.
The question is, in any way, shape, or form, whether or not it's a political question, do I, you're asking me, feel like I've produced something of value if I've changed people? So if you're asking in a case like the oil book, it's political. If you're asking in a case like this, there's a political message here and there's a personal message here. If I'm writing about loneliness and someone's reading it and they become more sensitized to loneliness, then I would say, yeah, I've accomplished something. If you want to look at it politically, about how the spy world destroys human beings, then it's political too. So if you're asking personally as a shrink talk, do I feel valid from this? In both ways, the answer would be yes.
Yes, thanks.
Right? Yes. Okay.
I've got a mechanical question. I saw what you meant about surface tension throughout the entire passage you read, which is really nice to see how you made the sentences crackle, so to speak, as as we hear them. And also I loved the moment when you said apple and pumpkin colored leaves. Instead of giving colors, you gave fruit, which was so vivid to bring them to life. But you also talked about choice, which I thought was fascinating when you were talking about that beforehand. And is there a moment of choice in that passage?
You're asking me whether?
Yeah, the moment of choice. Because you're saying choice is key.
Well,
and that looks like it's very early in the book.
He chooses to leave that classroom. He chooses right away to divorce himself from the very people that when we pick this up 20 years later in Washington, all those people are now in the U.S. They're all spies. They still have to deal with each other. They don't deal with anybody else. It's still a closed world, and he's working at the Washington Post. When we pick this up, the very next sentence is 20 years later, he's a Washington Post reporter. Cabot is a vice secretary of state. Karina is a big Washington lawyer lobbyist. They're still working for the Kremlin. And so his choice instantly is to try to get away from the people he can't.
And it opens up onto vistas of time, as you say, like the choice of the Vietnam vet you were describing, which flashes back to Vietnam, that it's 15 years later, you open 15 years later, and then flash back into Vietnam and their childhood together.
Yes.
Yeah, it's nice when time emerges like that and becomes alive.
And how you handle time is so important. When do you start in the present? When do you start in the past? When do you set it up in the past? When do you flash back after 50 pages? Those are strategic decisions, but strategy comes last. Strategy never comes first. That's a great question, because many times when I'm teaching, if I'm lucky enough to get asked to college, people come in and they'll talk about the strategy before they talk about what the book is about. Mm-hmm. And they still can't answer. They're trying to evade what the book's about by coming up with a strategy. You had a question.
I was just going to make a comment about Stephen King is one of my favorite authors. But the biggest problem I have with him, and I noticed in the beginning of your story, to me, he seems to over-describe things. I mean, to the point where he'll talk about a shirt, and the buttons, and the collar, that don't seem to make, at least while I'm reading it doesn't seem to make a point to the story. I think over-description can be a bad thing.
Are you asking me if I think over?
Yes.
In my mind, I was a giant fan of Stephen King in the beginning, and the book started getting longer and longer and longer and longer. And there was one of the books, I think it was It. I mean, the guy's a genius. And plus, he described how to make a grilled cheese sandwich better than anyone ever in history. And he has changed the way that I make. People get changed by what they read. I now make grilled cheese sandwiches the Stephen King way. But it did get to the point where I could literally flip 40 pages and be in the same scene.
Me too.
I've heard, but I don't know that he likes going long. So,
Yeah.
But that's also your personal preference, my personal preference. People are still buying the book.
Is that what it is to be in the zone where he's describing in detail? Is that kind of like what you were referring to earlier about being in a zone where the creative process just comes out?
It is.
Yeah.
It is being in the zone, but that doesn't mean that when you emerge from the zone, an editor is not required to cut back what you did while you were in the zone.
So do they not edit him because he is Stephen King?
You're asking me something. I can only guess.
Yes.
I can tell you what happened. What probably happens is this. What usually happens is this. You finish your book, you give it to the editor. If the editor is not paying attention because you're going to sell 1 million copies anyway, it goes like that. If it's an editor who, editors will make suggestions. They're suggestions. They don't have power. I mean, even when I was starting out with my first book, I wasn't Stephen King. They would say, we think you should do this and this and this and this and this and this. And I would think about it. I would say, I agree with this. I don't agree with this. And they'd go, it's your book. That's what they do. They go, it's your book. This is why I like books and not Hollywood. It's like Hollywood's like my book. So, yeah, it's an organic process.
Did you write the last spy with under your name?
Yes.
And that's fiction. And now you only write nonfiction under Bob Reiss and.
What's the deal with the names? That's what you're asking, right?
Name?
Why do I keep changing my name? Okay. There's a sexy reason, pathetic reason. And this is a personality test for you. Who wants the pathetic reason first? You see? Shrink wants the pathetic reason first. Who wants the sexy reason first?
Okay.
You can't change. You cannot
And
change.
choose both.
All right. The sexy reason first. The sexy reason isn't as valid as it once was, but as a journalist, I've been lucky enough, or whatever, to interview some very important people. Spent time in the head of Interpol, president of the Maldives, governor of Missouri. In each of these cases, when I got to the Maldives, or when I got to Missouri, or before I got to France, they check you out. They check you out. I got off the plane in the Maldives, and they come and pick me up at the airport, and they go, we checked you out. And you don't want, and at that time, I was writing the Ethan Black series, which started out as a sex crimes detective. So when you are asking to interview the president of the Maldives about global warming, you don't want them finding, wait a minute, is this about global warming, or like what's the sex crimes detective stuff? So that's the sexy reason that makes sense. Now the pathetic reason goes to how the publishing industry is, which is everybody's watching everybody else. So let's say you write a book and a publisher likes the book, and now they're deciding how much to offer for the book. So the first thing they do is they look at how many books sold last time. They may have printed only a few last time. 2 of my books came out on 9/11. You know how they sold? The publisher only looks at the numbers, because the publisher believes that the bookstore will only order the same amount of books they ordered last time. And the bookstore owner believes that the publisher will only print as many copies as they printed last time. In the old days, when there were a lot of bookstores, there was Barnes & Noble, there was Dutton, there was Crown, there was Walden Books, there was all these places, and there were a lot more independents. It was less important. But these days, 2 people are buying the books for the whole country, right? And so my editor, when it was time to switch to Ethan Black, whatever the numbers were on the book before that, weren't as good as we would have hoped. And my agent said, well, why don't you change your name? Because there won't be a track record, and the publisher will read it and just offer what they think it's worth and not look at the numbers. First, I got 3 times more for that book than I'd gotten for any other book. And second, and even better, the editor who bought it sat to my left in my Thursday night poker game and didn't know it was me. Didn't know. He found out at the poker game. It's you? That's right. So those are the 2 reasons.
And you're still living secret lives.
I'm still living secret lives?
Like you were when you were married and you were, the perfect couple.
These are the shrink questions.
Let's
the
talk
shrink
about
questions.
that.
What, the secret lives?
Yeah.
No. Well, there is, I will admit, a secret other name that's not on the table, and that name is Dr. Robert Daphne, who wrote the book How to Kill Your Girlfriend's Cat. So you can imagine, but that's the answer to the names question. It's unfortunate, but it's true. And now it's even more, the only thing that Barnes & Noble looks at now is how many copies sold last time. And it's all algorithm driven.
It's like, what have you done for me lately? The Hollywood quote.
Pardon?
In Hollywood, they always say, what have you done for me lately?
Yeah, but now that mentality is creeping into books, more and more. Yeah, in Hollywood they say, what have you done for me in the last 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Not even lately. So,
They were talking about the length of like a Stephen King's book, where he's got 40 pages of nothing. Is there like a rule of thumb or something as far as the length that a novel should be, or fiction?
we always avoid, that's a great question. Think of Game of Thrones, right? Or the Gene Aul books. I just read Shogun for the 7th time. Those are big fat books. But they tend to like between 70,000 and 90,000 words. But it's not a rule of thumb, because your job as an author is to get the reader to forget that you exist, and to forget that their house exists, and their car exists, and their kids exist, and the only thing that exists is their book. And if you have a 1,200-page book that captivates them every second so that they don't want it to end, if you can pull it off, that's fine. But rule of thumb, 70,000 minimum, 90, 100,000 maximum. That's a lot of room to play.
How many pages is that?
Depends on whether if you're double spacing, how your printer works. But the programs will tell you how many words. Yeah.
It's interesting, that question about detail and the level of detail to put in a narrative, because you've got a lot of detail of American 1960s detail in the opening pages, and then you just pull the carpet out from under us at the end. Mm-hmm. And so all that detail is there, and it topples when the kid reaches the barbed wire fence, and there's the soldier on the other side. And there's just the flat vista beyond.
But the details are also part of the setup.
Yeah, it's a beautiful setup.
And in what you were asking about Stephen King, which is interesting, I mean, my first editor at Simon & Schuster used to read books with his hand going like a metronome. Mm. And as long as the metronome pace stayed the same, you didn't need to cut. So too much detail and the metronome would start misfunctioning. I think we're over the hour, so thank you for coming.
What's next for you?
What? Thank you.
What's next for you?
I'm waiting to see if the new book's sold. So I'm waiting even right now. I didn't bring the phone because I didn't want to buzz in my pocket. We'll see.
What character?
A new character.
A new character.
Yeah. So.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.